this tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at grouping and parenting. And grouping and parenting is going to be very important for us when we are working inside of Maya to do rigs and character setups and things like that, because it gives us a little bit more control than what we might otherwise be able to get just with working with objects directly. So let's create a couple of objects. So we have two spheres here. We can take a look at how we can group these. The method that I use that's a little bit faster is I'll select them, push Control G, and it will create a group. You can see in the outliner here that it is there. If you don't have access to your outliner while your window is open, just go to Window, select Outliner, which is right here. So when I grouped them together, basically it took those two original objects and it put it into another node above it. The group creates the pivot right at the center of the scene. So we can actually move them both together if we have the group selected. So we can rotate, we can scale everything together so they work kind of as a unit. But if we select each individual object, we can move that individual object independently while still having access to the group. By default right now, we don't have a way to access that group, and I mean groups just have nothing to select. They're kind of like invisible objects that exist that have a translate, rotate, and scale. It is using that information to be able to move the other objects inside of that group. Everything that we are working with, it's good practice to make sure that it has a name. Typically, I'll give it, like, maybe this is my spheres group, and then I'll end up with an underscore GRP for group. So that way, when I'm looking at things, I can see that that is my group. Typically, geometry, I'll do kind of something similar, where I'll have underscore geo and underscore geo. So this is kind of like the simple way to get things out into a group so that we can manipulate them together. Let's get rid of that right now. And then we're going to start off with two new spheres in the scene so that we can look at it grouping in another way. So the first time I did was with Control G. You can also go to select both of them together, and we can go all the way down here to group. And you can see here that we have the Control G as part of the group. There is a ungroup option, so with the ungroup, you can select the group node above everything and then tell it to ungroup, and it will remove everything from the group. So that's through the menu here in the edit to be able to group and ungroup. Now, the next thing we're going to be talking about is parenting, which has a lot of similarities to grouping. There's going to be a parent-child relationship when you do parenting. That's why it's called parenting. So the parent is the object that moves, and then the child will move with it. But the child can also move on its own independently from the parent. So if we take this and let's say sphere 2 is going to be the child of sphere 1, I'm going to select that, select the parent last, and then push P on the keyboard. So we can see that after we do that, we had both of them selected, and then it goes to only selecting the child. The child, like I said, can move independently, while if we select the parent, which is the sphere, it will move together with the other sphere that we have, the sphere 2, which is the child. So if we look in the hierarchy here in the outliner, this is going to be our parent sphere. And then this is going to be our child sphere. So anything that we do with this one will move the child with it, and then the child will kind of roam around and do whatever it wants on its own. And it works with everything that we have with the transforms that we have here. So if I rotate it, you can get a rotation that goes around the parent, the child rotates around the parent. But as that rotates, you'll see that the original object still has its pivot in its own space there. So you can rotate each one of them independently. And then scale is the same thing. We scale the parent and we can scale the child. So that if we scale the parent, the child scales with it. If we scale the child, the parent doesn't do anything. One thing that I like to use parenting a lot for is to create, I'm going to duplicate this, a way to match up the alignment. Actually, it might be a little bit better to do it with a cube. So I'm going to create 2 cubes here. So let's say I had this object here, and it is way up there in a position. We can try to like snap it and then try to position it to be just right with the other object, but that can be a little bit time consuming and maybe not as precise as you want to. You can also go in and copy all these values that you have here independently, and that could be another way to do it. But the way that I found that is really easy and quick to do it is just to take the object that you want to match up with this object here. So I'm going to select that and then select the object that we want to parent it to. Push P to parent. And even though this is at the origin now, you can see that the values change here. And that's because now its origin is considered to be its parent object. So if we zero everything out, we'll see that it goes actually to its new origin. So I put 0 in all the fields here. And you can see that now it matches exactly with the other object. And scale would be, I didn't modify the scale, but instead of zeros, you would go to 1 because that's the default for scale. But we can see now both of these objects, so that's the child object and this is the parent object. Even though they are right on top of each other, they are exactly at the same place. Then if you need it to be at world space and not be a child to that anymore, just hold Shift P to unparent. And we can see that now if we go between the 2 of them, it will actually have the same transforms here. I've been doing parenting with the keyboard, but you also have option to do the parenting here in the edit menu as well. So you can parent with a P, or you can Shift P to unparent. So those are your options to do it within the menu as well. Okay, so also right now we have been just using like 2 pieces of geometry that are the same type. They're both polygon primitives, but what you'll see with a lot of control rigs is that we have an object like that, and then we have a control object that ends up being some sort of curve. So we can use a curve right here. So this is a NURB circle. And we can use that as our object that we are parenting to. So another way that we can parent that we haven't shown so far is directly in the outliner. So let's parent this object here to this curve here. We're going to middle mouse button drag the sphere into the NURBS curve. And then now if we select the NURBS curve, we can see that that is the parent of the object now. And we look inside, we have the child, which is a sphere, and then the parent, which is our controller object, which is a NURBS circle. The reason NURBS are used a lot for being controller objects for animation is that they're not as intrusive as like physical objects, so that you can actually see the geometry you're working with a lot easier with it. Also, when you render, let's look at the render. I'm just going to do a Maya software render, so it's pretty quick. When you render, your geometry will render, but the curves won't, so you don't have to do any extra work in the Maya software renderer to be able to hide the curves and things like that. There are some renderers out there that will render the curves for you, and sometimes that's useful, but in most renderers they won't. by default, and you have to kind of make them render when you need it to render. So that is a really good reason why to use the curves as controller objects, because they actually don't interfere with the scenes that we're working with, so that we can see our animation a lot easier. Okay, that's the end of this lesson. In the next lesson, we'll be taking a look at joints and looking at the fundamentals of using joints, and a lot of this parenting stuff that we've been looking at right now will actually cross over into when we start using joints. See you guys in the next lesson.